PodSaaS, where we're putting the SaaS back in sassy. Sponsored by Leader Pro, where you can book demos with target customers on demand and fill your sales pipeline instantly.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PodSaaS. I'm your host, Chris Shang, and today we've got Justin Norden from GSR Ventures. How's it going, Justin?
Good. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. And I assume you're coming to us from the Bay Area?
Yes, in the Bay Area. Currently live in San Carlos, and our office is in Palo Alto, just a few minutes away.
Very cool. So this is more of a unique situation. We have you as a partner at the GSR Ventures, and so, but I also know that you've been a founder before, so we'll get into that story. But if you can share with us a little bit more just around the underlying thesis for GSR, which you guys look at, what's a strong fit for a candidate for investment for you guys?
Absolutely. So GSR Ventures, we're a health tech focused venture fund today, a little bit over $3.5 billion under management, investing out of our eighth fund. So we focus on early stage seed through Series B investments in health technology. We've written checks as small as 100,000, as large as 100 million into companies that get us really excited. But what is that? It's really companies that are trying to use new technologies, data science tools to fundamentally change how we're delivering care or making that care possible. So we've done things like asynchronous telemedicine platforms, where how can you interact with the doctor, but not necessarily in real time on a video visit, but send in a text, get the prescription that you need, get the answers that you need. We've done things like digital therapeutics, where it's software that's gone actually through the FDA process, phase 3 clinical trials, to actually deliver a treatment. So companies like Limbix, delivering adolescent mental health care through actually an application on your phone. And we've done things like Medable, trying to decentralize clinical trials, allow patients to enroll from home, and really change who is really able to participate in clinical trials. And so it's companies that are really using these technologies and targeting transformative change. We're a team of physicians, we're a team of former founders, former technologists. And so people with kind of those backgrounds wanting to break in and change healthcare get us really excited.
Awesome. Super interesting. Yeah, I've worked with at least half a dozen, I think, like healthcare tech startups. And, I think, in the real world, like application of it, I mean, it's definitely like got its hurdles, right? Like from adoption to, I know like there's physicians that are weary of tech just because they're so nuanced and kind of like their day-to-day operations and how they do things. And so, I've worked with like AI scribes, for example, and how do they overcome certain barriers? And a lot of the times it's kind of like, you have to find the specific type of practice where it's like a fine balance, where it's like not life and death situations, that it can involve some level of experimentation and adoption for it to prove itself out, and then get enough like of that data in order for that product to become like fully effective, supposedly, and then being able to then, I think, like level up into different categories within the medical field. But it's super interesting when you actually talk about go-to-market, and I've had like a lot of experience with that and some of the trials and tribulations, but also the successes in it. And so curious as to how you guys discuss that, or how you guys think about it internally. But before we get there, would love to know your journey. And we do a thing called just rapid fire questions, where we ask a series of questions and just get to know our founders, as well as just you and our guests a little bit more personally.
Perfect. That sounds good. And we can talk a lot.
Awesome. Cool. First question here is pretty straightforward, but do you have a favorite entrepreneur and or startup story? And it could be one of the same if it's the same thing.
I'll give a favorite kind of entrepreneur and startup story. I'll give a shout out to Justin Norden.
Okay.
So he is actually a Seattle founder. Actually grew up getting to kind of see his story firsthand, but he was the founder of Justin TV, a couple other companies, which later turned into Twitch, the company, everyone's familiar with here today. But one of the fun early startup stories that, he talks about very openly on, his work that he does was, getting started with Justin TV. It was the first kind of live streaming video platform. And this was, ages ago when it wasn't so easy just on your cell phone. And so they had this whole backpack where they were having to film people walking around, and he was doing it himself. He kind of put himself live on the air for basically a year, 24/7 to do this. but it goes all the way just to show you kind of the hustle that entrepreneurs will go with all the way through. You talked a little bit about, getting some altercations with the police and getting the equipment confiscated, but kind of a fun story to kind of hear someone who really kind of put it all out there to get a startup going.
Yeah, I love Justin. He's after he sold Twitch, I remember him going on like a 2-year hiatus and like taking a break from everything, and coming back, and just now he speaks a lot also in regards to like mental health and kind of that whole side of things, where I think it is often kind of like an undertold story when it comes to startups. And when you think about statistically speaking, like the number of companies that start in any given year and where they're going to end up a year from now, 2 years, 3 years from now, it's like, majority is going to fail, right? So what ends up happening to these individuals that embark on this very arduous journey, to say the least, and how do they handle it? But he's got some really good insights that I feel like he shared along the way as he's kind of came out of his own things.
Absolutely. And we need more of that, because it's a lonely journey. And so, people who've been through it, the more we can share and, make people know when they're, struggling, that, hey, you're not alone on this.
Yeah.
It's just so important.
Absolutely. Second question here is, do you remember what you wanted to be as a kid, and thinking back to like 9, 10, 11 years old?
I did, actually. I was one of those kids and who grew up at that age, and I thought I was gonna be a doctor. So while it did check the mark, I never imagined I was going to be a venture capitalist. Happy to go more into that later.
Awesome. Next question here is around your most painful experience, and this could be personal or professional. And just to give it a little bit of context, I think the most exponential growth that we typically experience will come from a place of extreme discomfort. So is there anything that you can, again, recall professionally or personally where it was super difficult going through it, but looking back at it now, you would say it's like character defining?
Well, a professional journey that I would say was just incredibly difficult navigating was the process of selling our startup. It ended up being kind of a 7-month process from start to finish. I like to say it was kind of 2 months of interesting and fun and exciting conversations, and 5 months of pain, just going through just the negotiations back and forth, kind of different incentives of every party, all the legal work to finally get through to the end. So, I think, professionally it's an accomplishment I'm proud of, but it definitely leaves a few scars from the process.
Fair enough. Next question is, what motivates you in the 25th hour?
What motivates me most in the 25th hour is, that I get to work on kind of merging technology and healthcare. That's why I never imagined I was going to be a VC doing it. This is what I wrote my personal statements on for going to medical school and business school and kind of all these other paths where, fundamentally, I just believe that there's this huge gap between what we know is right from a medical profession and then, unfortunately, like what gets done to so much of our population. And I just think there's this possibility that we're going to see in our lifetimes where we're going to truly democratize that access to knowledge. So the gap between what we know and what gets done is as small as possible. And it's just incredibly exciting to me. So
obviously starting a startup is hard, and you've gone through that journey, and luckily successful exit from it. But, in those early days, it's wearing a lot of hats, it's doing a lot of different things, it's getting through a lot of stress. I mean, is there anything personally that you go to decompress? Absolutely. Exercise for me. Yeah.
It is. I'm just convinced it is the cheat code to life. It makes you smarter, happier, more attractive, really gives you more energy. And so, whenever I'm upset or my, partner says, hey, is something off? It's like, oh, maybe you should go work out. And it's like, oh yeah, I'll probably feel better afterwards.
Fair enough. Anything particularly you do fitness wise?
I ended up getting a Peloton here, but actually nice. the thing that makes it the most relaxed is I play ultimate frisbee.
Oh, cool.
So I've competed nationally, professionally around the world, and nothing like decompressing completely, just running around there.
Fair enough. I alluded to this just before, but you wear a lot of different hats along the way as an entrepreneur. Has there been a skill set that you've picked up, that you've had a strong emotional disposition towards one way or another, either loved or hated, that you just never thought you would pick up, but you had to?
I guess just one of the fondest memories as I think about, the startup journey and getting to grow the team. One, it's, that early moments working late with your co-founders. But I think one of the things I didn't know I would like so much is just as we grew the team and just had those all hands calls with everyone there, just I found thinking, what could I do to, make our culture a little bit better? What could I do to just get people a little bit more excited about being here? Just got me jazzed.
Next question, a little bit more personal, but one, do you have a bucket list? And then two, what's one of the more ambitious items on that bucket list?
I'd say I probably have less bucket list items than most. I think, one of the things I constantly ask myself is, am I in a position where I get to have the most impact on these goals? And, I joke, I guess one of the items there is, have we solved healthcare? And I joke, once we've solved healthcare, then I'll go back to practicing as a doctor, but maybe a few years out.
Got it. Last question here is the idea of legacy, but more importantly, and I think you're already starting to touch on it, is the impact that you want to leave on this world before you leave it.
It's really that. I think, growing up in I guess a twofold, growing up in a family of physicians on one side, but then also growing up in Seattle, where I just kind of saw the scale of what a technology company could do. Bill Gates setting the bar with kind of Microsoft of, hey, this is what impact at a global scale looks like. And then even after Microsoft, kind of what he's done afterwards and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and just impacting the trajectory of kind of human diseases across the globe. And so, that's the bar. And so, how can I work and kind of utilize my background as a computer scientist, as a former technologist, as a doctor, and work to bring those fields together. Like that's what I want to be known for. Kind of looking back and however many years, I hope we live a long time at this point, but however many years it takes.
Fair enough. Cool. That's it for the rapid fire questions. It's super helpful for us to get to know you a little bit more. And there's a lot of nuggets in there that I want to extrapolate on. Specifically, would love to kind of get to know, you mentioned you already being a kid, you wanted to be a doctor, you went to medical school. So were you a practicing physician before you ended up starting your first venture?
So I wasn't, I spent, basically my whole life in healthcare, getting to see what, my family went through, what my father went through as a physician, every, internship, early experience through high school and college was doing research, hanging around the clinics, et cetera. And then, my journey during medical school, during medical training, I did both my medical degree and business degree at Stanford, was like, whoa, how is this how we're practicing medicine? I did my computer science before, and so it was like, wait, differential diagnosis. This is a rank order list of, different symptoms coming in to find a rank order list of potential diseases. Like, this is an intro computer science problem. How are we doing this way? And so I was really just banging my head against the wall during clinical training for, there's got to be a better way to do it. Ended up kind of stepping out multiple times. We launched a Center for Digital Health. We were doing telemedicine visits out of Epic, getting to see what that was like before its time. Actually, we ended up shutting down that clinic because it wasn't, the world we live in today where people were used to that. Mm-hmm. Ended up jumping over to Apple on the healthcare team, launching some of the features, live in the Apple Watch around women's health, around research studies at scale, going to 1 billion phones was there something that was so exciting. And so ultimately ended up kind of leaving to run my company. And then, that's why I said, once we solve healthcare, I'll go back. But, maybe still a few years before that happens.
Got it. And what was the push for you? I mean, I think it's one thing to have that inherent curiosity, but is there the other part of it, I guess, is like having the engineering knowledge or the engineering knowledge, I guess, to a certain degree, because not all it's unique in and of itself, because I don't think like a lot of medical professionals necessarily, have the engineering acumen or the knowledge base. But where did that come from? How did that originate? Was that something that started off when, you decided to go to business school, or was that before then? Yeah.
So just kind of taking a step back, I was always interested. I was just kind of a nerdy kid growing up. I was the kid who wanted to just build my own computer, was curious to see what that looked like. And then in college, the plan was to do pre-med, go be a doctor. But I, took an intro computer science course from what later turned into my advisor and just a close friend and mentor to this day. And he said hey, you like this stuff, you're good at it. You should, it's going to be useful for you later. And I said, no, that makes no sense. Who needs computer science? What's happening here? this was just as I think, jobs were starting to get outsourced around the world, and people were like, oh, who knows, is computer science even going to be important in the future? But, ended up doubling down on that, majoring in computer science and actually doing a master's in computational biology, which is machine learning and genomics. And it was really just kind of a hobby. I just kind of liked it. But as I started to kind of go into then clinical training, I was just one of the few people with this background, and just was someone who's curious, just kept that kind of asking questions like, wait, why is it this way? I know of other ways I can make it better, just because kind of the different viewpoint that I took into the problem, which, I think is just so common in entrepreneurial journeys. If you just see a different way that it could be based on, whatever background you're coming from, and saying, okay, like I want to take this thing and apply it to this other problem over here. And so that was just kind of, my journey through it.
Yeah. I mean, I asked that because I think that as a non-technical founder, and I think just speaking kind of on more, and knowing friends that are in like the medical profession, but the idea of like, when you have an engineering background, or ultimately you work with people who have that technical background, there's something that for me personally that it clicks, where you realize, oh, we are kind of in the matrix, and anything that you want to build is actually pretty much possible to build. But there's a large chunk of the population that don't necessarily have that belief system. And that's why I was curious as to like, where did that come from originally? Because I'm sure there's a plenty of other people that were studying, in getting their doctorate degree and not necessarily thinking about in the same way or the same context as you were, right? And so not asking those questions, not pushing the boundaries of like, this could be done better and all that. So yeah, that's why I was curious as to where that came from, because that's ultimately the marriage of how you create innovation, is like having somebody who gets that has domain expertise in a specific field.
I'd just say the last part of it is it's just the like impetus to get started, which I think is the scariest part, right? As, we're talking to, new entrepreneurs thinking about it. It's like, I don't know these things. I certainly don't have all the answers. I, have to provide for my family. I have to do all these things. I need to, make sure I have a job. And, I really credit that a lot to, just the institution and culture, just kind of around Stanford, and just even getting to see stories where, I was lucky enough to just people go before me where it's like, oh my gosh, they just didn't get a job and built their company, built their crazy idea, even though they didn't know how it was going to make money or, what they were going to do, but they just went for it. And just reducing that barrier of just kind of fear where, hey, it's going to be okay. If you work hard, if you run at it, maybe it doesn't succeed, maybe pivot to something else. But just even knowing that that's like a real option and a thing for you, I think was just so important for me getting started. I'm a pretty risk averse person, right? I, got a bunch of different graduate degrees and just pushed it off for as long as possible until finally it was, hey, this interesting idea. Or
yeah. So talk us through a little bit more about that, your first startup ultimately, which is, I think it was Trustworthy. This is the one that you exited. Okay. Well, how long ago was that? And then how did you make the jump from, I think it was, you said from Apple to then that? Was it already something that you were doing as like a side project and then it started getting traction and you switched over full-time? Or was it like an idea that you had and then you left to pursue full-time? How did you make that transition?
Yeah, so this was one of the things that, I'd been working on. One of my best friends since I was doing grad school in Cambridge. We had partially chosen to come to Stanford together. He convinced me to come to the West instead of, going to the East Coast for med school at the time. And, we'd always just been, spinning on research, working together on different things. At the time we realized we had no idea about startups. We come to Stanford, it's okay, great, I'm going to learn. You need to raise venture money and do all these things, but you definitely don't have to. But we were just trying to figure that out. And we had a few false starts, with companies that, we published some research around, gaits and what you could use using machine learning models to understand how someone was walking or what was possible. And then, almost got recruited to join a company, almost joined them and said, wait a second, we don't know these people. This is a horrible idea. Partially it was through that experience that convinced me I needed to go to school and just learn a little bit more. And so, just kept iterating on these ideas, doing work, kind of doing some proof of concept things. So finally, coming to the kind of idea we're working on at Trusted AI, where, we have all of these, we had this first generation of AI models that, hey, great, we're going to optimize ads for you. We're going to do personalization in this different way. But, to me, what got really exciting is, how do we do AI for these kind of next generation applications? How do we use AI models in medical devices where we understand, hey, if I have an artificial pancreas that's giving you insulin and glucagon to manage your blood sugar, how do we know that these are safe? How do we actually push these algorithms towards failure to understand what happens when things go wrong? And so we started working on some methods and wrote some papers around, proving that and showing what that was like. And ultimately started to say, hey, is this enough to really get started, build a company around this? Interestingly, after getting started, we realized no one actually really cared about med device. I think the medical field, as we talked about before, is just so removed from the cutting edge. It is just so risk averse. They weren't ready for kind of these cutting edge machine learning methods to understand safety and risk. Ultimately pivoted after some more work and publishing some papers in the autonomous vehicle space. Where, they did want to know, they did really care, and were willing to kind of work with kind of cutting edge methods for how this looked like. And so, kind of personally kind of a crazy journey. I think I'm probably one of the only, if only, physicians who's worked in the autonomous vehicle industry, and getting to see what that was like. And, thought about it more and spending more time, but said, hey, it's great getting to see the cutting edge, but, I need to go back and focus on healthcare. But that was my kind of weird N of one entrepreneurial journey.
Got it. How did you guys make that decision to pivot the business ultimately? Was it just kind of realizing that the market wasn't there in the medical space, and then taking that technology and seeing where it would find a place to live?
Yeah, and it's absolutely what I would say is not my recommendation for how startup founders could go. If I could do it again, even before we wrote a line of code, I want to know exactly the customers I'm selling to. I want to know that they care. I want to even have an LOI before I even go out with that product. But ultimately, I think sometimes innovation goes the other way. Sometimes you build something amazing and then kind of see where it fits in. And so for us, we were early enough that we weren't sure. It's not like we had, years and years and effort and momentum, towards the medical device space. We were able to kind of just find where we saw traction, and there was just so much more pull and interest on the autonomous vehicle side.
Got it. And then how did you, ultimately, I guess it was pretty simple and straightforward to make the decision to end up selling the business, since it was now taking on a life of its own ultimately, right? And you kind of had to make a personal decision. It's like, is this the track I want to go, or do I want to kind of recalibrate and refocus?
Yeah, exactly right. And, it was, you definitely get pulled in directions you don't anticipate, starting a company, getting that going. And so for me, we're just like, okay, just had some reflection. What am I most passionate about? What I'm most excited about? And it's really healthcare. And well, I'm sure, would have learned a ton, just kind of continuing to spend time in that space. I just realized it wasn't what I was personally most passionate about. And so for me, kind of met also the team at GSR Ventures with kind of other physicians who had this background in tech, and this kind of dream or idea that we could kind of merge that in healthcare. And it's just like, oh yeah, that's where I should be. That's kind of the perfect fit.
Got it. Cool. Would love to know now your journey, as in VC, right? So, how do you tend to look at deals? What gets you guys most excited? Is it the idea? Is it the founder? Because at the end of the day, there's so many different variables, right? Like, you could be the most smartest individual coming out of MIT and have a team of founders that have great pedigree, at least on paper. And then if they can't sell, a lot of times that becomes like the biggest hurdle. and I've seen that so many times, and vice versa too, which is like, if you're naturally a salesperson, but then you don't have any technical acumen, or you don't know how to maneuver around like product development or even how to project manage, that becomes a hurdle. So how do you guys go about, making these decisions? And do you guys lead investments? Do you follow on, and how does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so I'll answer the easy ones first. So just in terms of like structure, typically we lead the investments. We're a nimble team where, when we get conviction, and what's honestly one of the things that makes my job easier is just I specialize and focus on health technology companies, usually the B2B ones. And so, I don't have to learn everything about, Web3 and what's happening in consumer and everything else, where hopefully, when I'm coming to see a pitch for the first time, I can very much know what's happening, and I don't have to follow someone else's diligence. I can do my own work. And then, we can say, yeah, we want to invest and we'll lead the round at this price, et cetera. So that's probably the easy part of structurally, and that's where we come in. I think from a, larger process standpoint, what gets us excited, what ideas or teams pull in, what aspects do we weigh most? And the answer is all of them. And it sounds kind of like a cop-out, but it's not that all of them have to be there from the step and point when we meet, but to ultimately be a successful company to the scale that gets us excited, it's going to be a company that eventually reaches $1 billion in revenue, not in just market cap. We've been lucky to be fortunate and work with a few companies from 0 to $1 million to $1 billion like that. And so all of those pieces will have to come together at some point in the company's journey. And when we meet a team or an early idea, maybe they'll have a few of them, but one, there has to be an acknowledgement that we'll need all of them. If it's a technical team, maybe they don't have that business expertise, but they better acknowledge that they need it, that it's important, and not just afterthought, hey, just build the product and it'll figure itself out, because that doesn't work. And if it's from the business side, do they have enough of the understanding of the technology, what they need to build, and ability to kind of recruit and make them go after that? Maybe one of the heuristics I use that's kind of fun to share about how we think about it and how we think about investment processes is, as I'm meeting an early founder and a team, do I want to work? Would I work for the founder? And why is that, I think, so interesting as a heuristic is, one, that's literally what I'm doing. If I'm signing up to, be on your board, be your partner for the next many, many years, is, it's my job. I'm helping work for you, helping making introductions to health systems, making, product conversations, strategy discussions, fundraising discussions. So, and I'm working for and with any founder that I pick. But two, it's kind of an interesting heuristic of, ultimately, if this person is going to be successful on a big scale, they're going to hire thousands of people. And if they can't convince you that there's someone that, you should work for, then how are they going to convince those thousands of other people? And so all of those aspects are important, but maybe that just gives a little bit of insight.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Another question here is, we talked about it at the beginning of the conversation, but the idea of like going to market and just knowing this space, how would you describe just healthcare technology in general from an end user perspective? So not the people who are building and innovating, but those that are going to be ultimately implementing and onboarding and going through that. And what's that kind of like personality type, and how would you compare that, I guess, to maybe a space that's a lot more on the forefront of like taking risk, where you've been in like the autonomous vehicle space, but like, how would you compare and contrast, I guess, those different markets? And and then just kind of like, what would be the kind of some of the hurdles that you've seen some really smart founders go through and have to overcome as part of this that journey?
Yeah. So I think selling into healthcare is probably one of the toughest markets to sell into. And so the funny thing is, so for, some software companies are horizontal and they could, really be anywhere. If you're a horizontal company, you should not sell to healthcare, is kind of the immediate early advice, because it'll take longer, they'll pay less, there's more compliance, and physicians are a total pain to work with. And so if you're a general, horizontal company, you shouldn't pick healthcare as a vertical, because it's just harder. Why is that? What are those, end user personas? So, one of them sometimes, a lot of digital health companies will sell to small physician groups, maybe a 1 to 50 physician practice. It's run by a physician, or maybe it's run by an outside CEO, but there's some, physician board. And I think what makes it harder to sell into healthcare is just the different incentives from those end users and what they're thinking about. It's not just, hey, does this make my business more productive and make me more money? That's one of the things they care a lot about. But then it's two, how does this affect my day-to-day and my time for seeing patients? Does this make me add a bunch of clicks I have to go through in my electronic medical record? Or is it just painful and make me add one more thing on a checklist? So that's annoying. Or, three, and then how does this impact patient care and what that looks like? While some people will say, oh, doctors only care about the financial side, that's not true. I think, they do care about that, but they also care about, is this good? Is this right for patients? And so I think one of the things that's a challenge for any kind of healthcare found were getting started is there are so many more stakeholders than a usual kind of SaaS business that maybe needs the CFO and, CTO or someone to sign off. It's like, no, you need, the CFO and the CTO to sign off, and the chief medical officer, and, compliance and risk, and so there's just a few more hurdles to go through, because it touches more people. I think the second part that makes healthcare so challenging is it's just an incredibly conservative business, right? The Hippocratic oath, do no harm. What that, it's a good idea and it's a good mentality. Unfortunately, what that gets also used to is don't change. It is more simple, right? Like, hey, whatever. This was how, I was trained by my, set of residency directors and their residency directors before, even though it might not be the best, current up-to-date method, whatever, don't change. This is what I've done. And so for a company to kind of find that fit, they need to know of these hurdles up front, think about how they're going to address each of them, and think about how they're going to somehow hack the system faster. So we can talk about some methods where, can you go through a channel partner who has relationships with all these clinics, and can you be a bolt-on, piece of software so you don't have to sign all of the kind of different agreements and can go in on what they're doing. While channel partners, I say, sometimes are scary in other aspects of SaaS, I think they can be a great option for healthcare companies to kind of get in quickly and scale. So I know that was a whole lot, so maybe I'll pause there. We can certainly go in more in depth on the go-to-market side.
Yeah, I mean, that's the part I think I'm, probably I personally am more curious about, but I think also the audience might be more curious about, is just like, I think because we could go deep, obviously, on the technology, which I think is it'll vary based on what you're trying to solve for, right? And it could be super sophisticated and deep rabbit hole. So. But on the go-to-market side of things, have you seen any examples, like when you say channel partners, for example, have you seen companies or founders like really nail down a go-to-market in this space, and what has that looked like? Not just from like a conversion standpoint, but ultimately, the combination of innovation and then being able to get adoption.
Yeah. Well, one of the companies in the portfolio that's really kind of nailed down to go-to-market and scale is a company called Medable. They're a company that's doing decentralized clinical trials, and they really were kind of one of the leading technology providers. We ended up investing in the company at the beginning of 2020. Michelle, she's a physician founder on the research side, the technology side, and Medable spent a few years kind of building the technology, getting ready, trying to talk with a number of the customers, and for their customers, right, they're working with big pharma as well as contract research organizations to actually run these trials. And they had the right technology, and then they were really kicked off by being there at the right time with COVID and something coming in of, hey, we need to run these trials now in a new way. We need to recruit patients at home. We need to do something else. And they had the right technology there, and then kind of the right channels to think about, okay, like we'll be flexible. We'll sell on a trial by trial basis to kind of these big customers. While initially that wasn't SaaS, right? Because it's not necessarily a SaaS product in that way. They're able to kind of move from, hey, we're going to sell kind of one fixed project at a time to, hey, we're so much more efficient, faster, and better to work with. Now we're going to kind of sell more SaaS-like bundles for periods of time where big pharma can run more things. And so they figured out a way to kind of sell one piece early and kind of quicker, prove that trust, because healthcare, again, contrasts with other industries, there's just so much trust. Like, you cannot screw it up. It's not just hey, we'll we'll send out a push, next week, we'll fix all the issues. It's no, like, people's lives are at stake, or, hundreds of billions of dollars, of drugs and R&D, et cetera, are at stake for something. So you really can't screw that up. And so how can you find that, from more generalizable statements, how can you find that kind of minimum bite-sized piece of work where you can go in, find that win, and then kind of scale to a bigger size? Is one of the things that they were incredibly successful at.
Makes sense. To that point, you brought it up. I mean, I feel like with COVID and the pandemic, it forced a lot of healthcare providers to start looking at technology a lot quicker. Have you seen, I guess the first question would be like, did you notice that kind of like industry-wide during the pandemic and seeing and hearing what has traditionally probably been a very quiet group of people around technology all of a sudden start clamoring and starting hearing a lot more noise around it. And then two would be, how has that translated to present day? And has that opened up these eyes, or have they started to kind of like shut down a little bit that energy and that momentum?
Such a good question. I've been banging it around in my head, wanting to do digital health for over a decade of like, this is the future, this is what makes sense, trying to talk anyone's ear off for it. And mostly it was like, oh, that's nice, Justin, I don't know, whatever. If you want to do like business stuff and be in medicine, like do biotech or something else. And that fundamentally changed. I think you're starting to see that, ramp up even over the past few years, and saying, hey, the regulations starting to get there around different kind of data sharing and access rights. And even as much as last week, even more data is being forced to be made available to every patient, and then by like API call, right? Which is something that didn't exist before. But then COVID, what it really fundamentally changed was the cultural barrier. Overnight, there was this adoption of telemedicine, right? It went from like less than 1% to peaking at like 80%. It's come down to roughly 15 to 20% of visits. But every single patient and every single provider thought this was possible. Not everyone liked it. Not everyone liked all the parts, but overnight, we just had cultural awareness of these new technologies and want that like, hey, you needed to do visits from home. You needed devices to monitor vitals and things in a different way. And so overnight, there was kind of this cultural adoption that probably pushed us the field ahead by 5 to 10 years from how long it would have taken. Just because, again, physicians are creatures of habit, don't want to change, don't really want to change unless they have to. But COVID was really a forcing function that showed them this was possible. And so if you look at where that has translated to today, or just even to in COVID, there are some companies that need a telemedicine solution. What would have been a 12 or 18 month sales cycle took 2 weeks. Was we need to come online with telemedicine visits like yesterday. What can we buy? What can we do? Hack together to make it happen. And so we saw crazy acceleration in some sales cycles to moving things faster. And then today, we still see a lot of that. It's not that extreme, but every health system across the country knows they need these new tools, now has some familiarity with onboarding some of these tools recently, and knows that kind of this is the future and that they have to change in the landscape. And so, valuations, if you look at that, and this is something we track, went way up and, came down some, with kind of the overhype or exuberance but that was really true across all sectors in tech, last year. But every health system today knows they need this technology, wants it, and sales cycles have shrunk. Where before, if you were trying to sell to a Medicaid plan, I kind of would have laughed at you if you were a startup. It's just, it wasn't possible. Now we're seeing it. Now we're seeing it kind of on a weekly basis with startups we talk with or startups in our own portfolio. And so, really the whole field is ready. And while people are like, oh, digital health, investment is down, the market has never been kind of more exciting to see new ideas. And there's never been so much pull and want for these new technologies than there is today.
Interesting. And I'm going to start winding things down here, but just the last few questions. And one would be, is there any particular field within medicine that you started to see have more demand for technology than others?
So one that we've really seen it, and it's been shown for more demand than others, is around mental health. This was something that actually published papers on a few years ago, and shame on me for not investing even more in the space, but people preferred, if you're having a repeat visit, to do it via telemedicine or just over the phone, rather than having to, if you're depressed, drive to a clinic every week, sit down, wait, schedule that time, have to show your face when you're not really feeling well. And so I think, tele mental health and just mental health at home and virtually was just something that has completely accelerated, in the pandemic, and then has really continued and stayed on today. People want their treatment virtually. They want that as an option. Maybe they'll go meet their provider in person once if it's an option, but then they'll continue that virtually. And so I think, mental health just has really been an underserved area for so long. And the pandemic really just blew up the cover on how big an issue this is. And, a lot of startups grew quickly to meet that demand. If you're following the media on them, some of them have had some kind of rocky stories, maybe taking some shortcuts that maybe they shouldn't have, which is something you will see and I think is tough, but ultimately, I think they are providing an incredible service for so many people who need it. And I think the demand will just continue to grow over time.
And then any particular field where you feel like there are companies that are out there doing something really innovative in that space that, again, if they can knock out the go-to-market strategy and then really hone in on that they have a pretty white space, kind of like green pasture type of opportunity?
So a huge green pasture opportunity I've wrote about and invested some in is around startups trying to treat Medicaid populations.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know, Medicaid is kind of the low income demographic and some other parts for our healthcare system where, versus someone with a commercial, call it Facebook level insurance, maybe a Medicaid state plan will pay someone 20 cents on a dollar. And so it's just a really tough area for, a Stanford Healthcare to treat those patients because they can't make their business work. And so what excites me about this space is as a startup says, hey, I want to treat these patients, they've historically just been a completely ignored patient population across the country because they don't make money. Health systems can't make their margins work. It just doesn't make sense. And so as a startup, if you're saying, hey, I'm going to deliver a software first solution where, hey, if I'm delivering a digital therapeutic, my marginal cost is zero to deliver that to more patients. I can work with 20 cents on the dollar for care. I can work in a way that's different. And no one's going to push back at you. If you're trying to take my fancy commercial patients, Stanford Hospital, I'm going to say, hey, no, I'm going to elbows up, try to keep those patients on my platform. If you want to take my Medicaid patients, go ahead. No one's going to push back at you. And so I think for, founders out there looking for opportunities where, hey, it's an early space, it's a $600+ billion market to go after, and no one is out there to compete with you. If you figure out your solution and work with a few states to get your solution right in Medicaid, the sky's the limit.
Cool. I think that's a good way to end it.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was really cool. That was really exciting to kind of hear about your journey, just your background, and then going a little bit deeper into that healthcare space has been really fascinating. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Chris, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much.